Testing my system here, and this is 100 psi of air pressure. Got my system hooked up here, and at 100 psi for several minutes now, no leaks whatsoever. My Indian head goober sealant stuff is holding just fine. None of my clamps are leaking. The check valves and the pumps are working perfectly. So, good to go. So I've got the fuel sending unit ready to drop back in the tank. Let me walk you guys through this modern marvel. So first of all, there are these things. There's 3 of these right here. So one is the supply. The center one is the supply. This one is the pressure regulator. This one was the fuel jet pump venturi thing. So what I did is took a piece of submersible hose that I had in there and looped them, because what I found is that the center right here is the pressure, and whenever I took this little cap off, up in here there's actually a gap where it pressurizes the cylinder. So it goes to the fuel pressure regulator and then it goes over here. So I loop these around so that I can guarantee the return fuel comes out of the center, and then it goes down pouring directly onto my hydromats. I mean, I've got it pouring directly on the higher one because it's not quite down in the gasoline. I've got my fuel sending unit taken care of to where it will reach the bottom of the tank. And then what I did to secure it was I took some stainless steel screws that I had from whenever I installed my gutters and screwed these 2 cylinders together, and then I did the same thing down here so that I can guarantee that it stays in place and that it's sturdy. And I zip tied my whole Y block assembly so both of those things are kind of giving each other strength. Got my 3/8 bulkhead fitting up there, and I put some epoxy down inside there. Well, I put epoxy in there because that's where it was leaking from, so that's completely sealed off now. And then what I did here is, because I don't have a connector, I was going to use this clear seal-all stuff, but it never really gets hard. It still maintains some amount of flexibility. So I'm using it to insulate these 2 crimps from touching each other, but I wanted something stronger to hold the connections onto the pins. So what I did was I used some gasoline-safe epoxy, which I got running around somewhere, but it says that it won't bond to nylon. So what I did was I drilled a hole straight through here, and then I put a cotter key all the way through and bent the cotter key around. So that cotter key goes through the signal wires right here and doesn't touch anything. And then it's also through the epoxy. So you can kind of see the epoxy started to splooge out a little bit right there. So that's perfect. So now I'm guaranteed that those things are in there for life. And if I ever need to take the fuel pumps off, they've got connectors right there. If I ever need to take the fuel hat off of the sending unit actually just unclips right here. There's a little detent. You press that and the sending unit will actually just slide right off. Of course it won't right now because I've got the zip tie in the way. So that is ready to drop in the tank. I have my fuel hose. I went and got some more of this Parker 801 push lock, except that's 1/2 inch or 5/8, or I can't remember what exactly size. I've got these things, and I did use the seal all right here because that's what it's designed for. This thing is most of the strength by itself, and this just seals the threads. So I double checked it with gasoline in there and it doesn't leak. So, and I've double checked, I actually poured gasoline in this one and it filled up that one whenever I was double checking my seals to make sure they don't leak. So got to put that guy back. That guy goes in there. those guys go in there, and then I'll start working on up here. So the plan is for up here, I'm going to rework this whole setup a little bit. I got to thinking about it, and I'm regulating the fuel and then putting it in here, which is kind of like a deadhead system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy right here, I'm going to loop it down to right here, and then go from the bottom of the regulator up to the factory line, so that factory line becomes my return. And then I'll use the return that I have down there right now as the supply line up here. And what I'll do is I will put my flex fuel sensor in the return so that it's constantly got fuel circulating through it to update the alcohol content as quickly as possible. And I'll probably end up bolting it right here to this bracket somehow, and then go from here into this flex sensor, and then a flex sensor down into there. It might be a little bit ugly, but I don't know. We'll just see how it works out. So, almost ready to put it back together and start it up. I wanted to take a second and go over measurements here. So, if I measure the inside diameter of the stock fuel rail, it's 6.4, but it kind of rolls down a little bit. So I imagine it's closer to 7 millimeters. If I measure the inside diameter of these fittings that I'm using for the Parker hose, they are 7.5 millimeters. So those are actually fairly large. If I measure the inside diameter of these other fittings, they're less than 6 millimeters. So what I'm doing, oh, come on now. And one of the things I've got to do is, because I changed my mind midstream about how to route the fuel line, this hose isn't long enough to make it up there. So I've actually got to splice a piece of hose. So what I'm doing is using a barbed joiner, like that. But this barbed joiner, if I measure the inside diameter of this barbed joiner, it's 6.9, but that's smaller than those guys. So what I'm doing is taking a drill bit that's just the next size up, that just barely scrapes, and I'm widening that. I also did that on the brass fittings that are in the tank that go to the Y block, because they are only 6.9, so I'm losing 3/4 of a millimeter, because this bulkhead is 7.5 millimeters internal. So I widened all three of those fittings down inside there, and these things are rated to like 700 psi or something like that. So shaving 3/4 of a millimeter off of the material isn't going to hurt anything. And really, it looks like less than that whenever you actually run a drill bit through. But that's just something else I'm trying to do to make sure that my flow is the biggest flow I can possibly get all the way to the rail. All right, so I finished running the drill bit through. I got 7.5, 7.6, something like that. This is where it started, at a little bit less than 7. And right now I'm at 7.5. That's about as much as I am comfortable. But now I'm going to have the same size pipe all the way from the hat to the rail. So I'm about to turn the fuel pump, and well, I'm actually about to connect everything up over here. But what I'm doing is I'm just double checking everything. I've got both tanks back in. I've got everything connected back here. But what I wanted to do is put the tires on it and get the car level so that I could check my work on the gauges to see how the fuel tank was working. And if I go back to my spreadsheet over here, at 1.2 volts, it's somewhere between 5, it's somewhere around 5 gallons, somewhere around there. And then if I go back to my scanner, it's hovering around 1.2 volts and it's showing me 5.1 gallons of capacity. And that's exactly how much I put in there. I put 5.1 gallons in there, so I'm dead nuts accurate. So what I've got so far is I've connected my last piece of hose to the splice here. That's my supply line. And I'm running it down into this bucket. And I know that I have enough capacity in there to hold everything I just put in the tank. Because the tank was literally bone dry. I literally took it and washed it out, dumped it out, cleaned it out to make sure all the shavings and all that stuff was out of the tanks. So both tanks were completely bone dry. I took a reading of both tanks bone dry and recorded that and saved that, just so I have that for future reference. And then I put the 5.1 gallons in the tank, recorded what happens when I fill it up, and you can see there's more in the driver tank than in the passenger tank, but that's because of the crossover pipe that I've got right there. I knew it wasn't going to be dead nuts even, but that's still pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the fuel pump. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to turn the fuel pump on until, here it is, fuel system, until the fuel pump starts to spit and I know that there's nothing left. Then I'll take a reading again, and that will let me know exactly where my empty is with tires on and the car level. That way I can guarantee I don't ever run out of gas because I set up the gauge wrong. So that's what I'm going to do next, is just run the pump until it goes empty, and then I can see how much is left in each side. I'm kind of impressed. The setup is working great because that's what the sensors were reading when the tanks were bone dry. Now it started coughing at about 0.9 volts. I have to go back and look at the log, but at about 0.9 volts, the 0.9 volts on this sensor, it started coughing a little bit. Let's see. I saw this read 0.9 volts, and then I saw it start coughing probably about right there. So 0.88 volts, something like that, it starts coughing. So that's what I'm going to have to dingle with it a little bit for the second sensor and the first sensor to make sure I get my low level correct. So now that I've got all that stuff measured, calibrated, recorded, now I've just got to hook up all this stuff up here. I've got to run my return to my flex fuel to my regulator. I've got to run the supply line up to here. Then I got to go from the regulator back to the factory line and all that stuff. So that's what I'm going to work on next. It looks a little bit like spaghetti, but it won't look quite this bad when I'm finished. So this one right here goes to the regulator dump underneath. This one is the actual pressure line that used to be the return line. And because I only have so much of this hose left, and I'm not exactly sure how to do this yet, and I'm probably going to waste some of it, I just took the line and looped it around and then clamped it down in there. So then that's the supply line right there. This is the old fuel pressure sensor. I've still got to figure out what to do with that. I'm not exactly sure yet. That's the one inside the car that's the fuel pressure sensor. And then this is the actual, I guess you would call this is the return. So it dumps off of the fuel rail straight into there, gets regulated, and then returned back to the factory fuel line. So that line used to come over here to this side, and it worked out perfect. And I'm not sure if that's gonna leak or not, because this is that Parker hose just kind of jammed down in there. So right now I'm just gonna prime the fuel system and check for leaks before I try to start it, and then go from there. Here's a quick look at how I have the hose that connects the two tanks together. And if you're worried about it being low, when is the last time you ever worried about your leaf springs dragging on something, or the bolts for your transmissions mounts dragging on something? Because it's actually above the gas tanks, just a hair above the gas tanks, just a hair above the bottom of the car. So, I mean, I've never worried about my gas tanks dragging on anything. I do have a small concern, like if I ever have to straddle something down the interstate, will it catch that? But I did put clamps on here that I don't really need, so it doesn't yank that hose off. But I'll just have to pay attention. But to be honest, if I straddle something, it could rip this off, it could rip those off, so I think it'll be okay, especially for eliminating the complexity of that stupid dual pumping system. So now I've just got to put it back together, fire it up and drive it.